frosty morning and noticed a strange glint on an iceberg. As he got closer, he saw dozens of frozen bottles stuck in the ice, but when he took one out and read the note inside, his heart skipped a beat. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning was heavy with silence, as if the sea itself had chosen to hold its breath. Samuel adjusted the thick woolen scarf around his neck and pressed his hand against the side of the boat to steady himself. The wood was damp with frost, and every creak of the hull reminded him of how old his vessel truly was. It was not the kind of boat that would ever impress anyone, but it was dependable, a companion that had carried him across countless mornings like this one. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, a shifting expanse of slate-gray water and thin sheets of ice drifting in the current. The wind stung his cheeks, turning the air sharp enough to cut, yet this harshness was familiar, almost comforting. Fishing was not only his trade, but the rhythm of his life. Samuel was a man of the sea in every possible way. His father had taught him how to read the waves, to listen to the subtle changes in the wind, to feel the pull of the water through the wooden oar before he could even write his name. His grandfather had done the same for his father, and so it went back further than Samuel could remember. This lineage tied him to the ocean in a way that words could hardly describe. When he pushed his boat away from the shore, he felt not only the presence of his own strength, but also the weight of those who had come before him. This particular morning, though, carried something different. The cold seemed heavier, the mist thicker, as if the sea was keeping secrets. He rowed steadily, his arms moving in slow, practiced motions. Every splash of the oar in the water sounded louder than it should, echoing across the silence. Above him, gulls wheeled and cried, their calls thin and mournful against the pale sky. Samuel raised his eyes to them for a moment, as he always did, for birds were often his only company during long hours on the water. He thought about how strange it was that they never seemed to feel the cold as he did. They cut through the icy air effortlessly, free and untethered, while he was bound to his wooden boat, to his nets, to the endless task of survival. As he reached deeper waters, Samuel set aside the oars and adjusted the nets, his fingers numbed despite the thick gloves. The work was mechanical by now, done so many times that his body carried it out with little thought. Yet his mind wandered. He thought about his small house back on the shore, its cracked walls and narrow windows that rattled whenever the wind pressed too hard against them. He thought about the photographs he kept tucked away in a wooden drawer, pictures of his parents and the few friends he had lost over the years. Fishing had left him with little more than memories, and though he had made peace with solitude, there were moments, like this morning, when the weight of it pressed heavier than usual. He pulled at the lines, lowering them slowly into the frigid depths. The water lapped against the sides of the boat in uneven patterns, as though restless. Samuel paused, squinting at the horizon. The mist there was beginning to clear, revealing something pale against the dark surface of the sea. At first, he thought it might be nothing more than ice, a drifting flow carried southward from distant, colder waters. But even from afar, the shape seemed unusual. It was not smooth like most icebergs he had seen, but jagged, uneven, with faint glimmers catching the morning light. He frowned, leaning forward slightly, his hand tightening on the side of the boat. The sunlight was weak, filtered through heavy clouds, yet whatever rested on that iceberg seemed to reflect with unnatural brightness. He narrowed his eyes, his breath misting in front of him as he tried to make sense of it. The instinct to ignore it tugged at him after all, Fishermen often came across strange things in the ocean, and most of them led only to trouble. But something about this particular shape refused to let him look away. The gulls had shifted as well. They circled above the iceberg, their movements restless, dipping and rising as if uncertain whether to land or to flee. Samuel knew enough about the sea to trust the behavior of birds. They were rarely drawn to ice unless it carried something that stirred their curiosity. It was this detail more than the glimmer that convinced him he should look closer. Slowly, he began to row in its direction. The cold water splashed against the oars, droplets stinging his skin like tiny shards of glass. Every movement of the boat sounded louder as he approached the pale shape. The iceberg loomed larger, its uneven edges rising like the bones of some ancient beast caught in frozen time. Yet it was not the shape itself that held him, but the strange scattering of light across its surface. The closer he came, the clearer it became that this was not the natural reflection of ice. He slowed his rowing, allowing the boat to drift on its own momentum. His eyes widened as details sharpened. There, embedded in the ice, were dozens of objects glinting like trapped stars. At first, they seemed like stones or crystals, but as the boat shifted and the angle of the light changed, recognition hit him like a sudden gust of wind. They were bottles. Dozens upon dozens of glass bottles, their surfaces catching the sun as though eager to be noticed after years in the dark. Some were shattered, leaving cruel edges jutting out of the ice like fangs. Others were whole, corks still sealed tightly, preserved by the freezing prison that held them. Samuel let the boat rock gently as he stared. His breath caught in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might be imagining it. Bottles scattered across an iceberg were not something the ocean delivered every day. He whispered under his breath, though the sound was quickly carried away by the wind. His hands tightened on the oars again, though he did not move closer just yet. His fisherman's instincts, sharpened by decades, told him that this was no ordinary discovery. The sea, usually his steady companion, felt suddenly different, almost watchful. The gulls screamed overhead as if trying to warn him, but Samuel remained where he was, caught between the pull of curiosity and the anchor of caution. He remembered the old stories, the ones told quietly by the fireside, about how the sea sometimes gave back what it had taken, but never without reason. Those stories were meant for children, yet at this moment he could not shake them from his mind. The iceberg drifted lazily, as though it were alive, carrying its cargo of frozen glass through the endless waters. Samuel shivered, though not entirely from the cold. He had set out this morning expecting nothing more than fish, the ordinary struggle of man against nature. Yet what lay before him was something far stranger, something that seemed to hum with memory, with voices trapped beneath the ice. He knew he could not turn away now. The bottles gleamed like eyes, watching him, waiting for him to choose. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to row again, each pull of the oar bringing him closer to the silent mass of ice and the secrets it held. The morning was no longer ordinary. The stillness that had greeted him at dawn had shifted into something else entirely, something tense and expectant. Samuel, a man who had always thought himself unshakable before the mysteries of the sea, felt his heart beat faster with every stroke of the oars. The horizon behind him blurred into mist, the shore forgotten. All that mattered now was the iceberg ahead and the strange, glittering promise it carried in its frozen grip. And as he drew closer, the first sharp edges of glass began to reveal themselves clearly, catching what little light the day offered. Samuel's breath quickened. He did not yet know what he was about to uncover, But deep inside he understood one thing. His life, like the sea around him, would never be the same again. The boat drifted closer to the iceberg, and Samuel felt the weight of the ocean beneath him shift in a way that unsettled him. The water seemed heavier, darker, as if reluctant to let him approach this strange monument of ice and glass. His oars moved slowly through the waves, each stroke deliberate, his breath clouding before him in the freezing air. The gulls still circled above, crying out in sharp, discordant notes that echoed across the empty sea. It felt to him as though they were guardians of some ancient relic, warning him to turn away before it was too late. But Samuel's eyes were fixed on the gleaming shapes protruding from the ice, and though his heart urged caution, his hands refused to stop rowing. As the iceberg loomed larger, he began to see its details with startling clarity. The surface was jagged and uneven, a labyrinth of frozen ridges and crevices that caught the pale sunlight in unpredictable ways. Yet the ice itself was not what drew him in. It was the bottles, scattered and suspended in their crystalline prison. There were so many of them that the iceberg looked less like a natural formation and more like a shrine constructed by unseen hands. Their glass bodies shimmered faintly, and the corks on the intact ones were coated with frost, as if sealed by the sea itself. He let the boat glide on its momentum until it scraped lightly against the edge of the ice. The sound made him flinch. It was a brittle, high-pitched crack, like the breaking of bones. For a moment, he hesitated, gripping the wooden side of his boat as he peered down at the frozen surface. The bottles seemed to be waiting. Some were wedged deeply into the ice, their necks barely visible, while others stuck out far enough that he could see their full forms. The broken ones were the most unsettling. Their shards jutted outward in cruel angles, sharp and merciless, as though the sea had deliberately shattered them to guard the secrets inside. Samuel reached for the hook he kept on board for hauling nets. Its iron edge was cold and heavy in his hand, and he pressed it into the ice with slow, steady force. The surface cracked faintly, chips of frozen water scattering across the planks of his boat. He worked at the first bottle cautiously, the hook scraping and prying until the ice loosened its grip. At last, with a sharp tug, the glass came free, landing with a thud against the side of the boat. Samuel set it down carefully, his breath quickening. The bottle was ordinary in shape, green-tinted glass that bore the faint scars of age. He held it up to the light, squinting at the frost that obscured the inside. Nothing was immediately visible. It was either empty or its contents had long since been swallowed by time. Disappointed, he placed it aside, his eyes already drawn back to the iceberg. There were dozens more, and he felt an inexplicable pull to examine them all. He leaned out farther, the boat rocking uneasily beneath him as he reached for another. This one was wedged tightly, and he had to hammer at the ice with the hook, each strike echoing across the empty expanse. The sound seemed to carry unnaturally far, bouncing off the mist and coming back to him like the beating of a drum. At last, the ice yielded, and he dragged the bottle free. Water trickled down its sides, droplets running like tears before freezing again in the bitter air. This second bottle was different. It was clearer, better preserved. Through the fogged glass, Samuel could make out something curled inside, faint and yellowed. His heart thudded as he realized it was paper, sealed long ago and forgotten in the heart of the sea. He ran his thumb over the cork, which was dark and swollen with age, fused almost seamlessly to the neck. For a long moment, he only stared at it, the reality sinking in. Someone had written a message, sealed it, and cast it into the ocean with desperate hope. and somehow, impossibly, it had been caught and carried into this drifting tomb of ice, waiting to be found. But Samuel was not ready to open it yet. He set it carefully at his feet, where the planks of the boat creaked beneath its weight, and reached again toward the iceberg. He felt a growing urgency, as though the bottles themselves demanded to be freed. Each one he pried loose told him nothing, yet together they whispered of a larger story, one he had not yet uncovered. Some were cloudy with sediment, others empty and cracked, but all were strangely deliberate in their placement. It was as if the iceberg had grown around them, adopting them into its form, preserving them against the erosion of time. The work was slow and punishing. His gloves were damp, his fingers stiff with cold, his arms aching from the constant struggle against the ice. Yet he persisted. With each bottle that fell into his boat, the mystery deepened. He began to wonder how so many had ended up here, trapped together in a single frozen mass. Was it an accident, a cruel trick of currents and tides, or was there intent behind it? The sea had always been merciless, but Samuel knew it was also full of patterns and secrets. Things lost were sometimes returned, but rarely without reason. When he paused to rest, the silence pressed in on him. The gulls had flown higher now, their cries distant, leaving him alone with the creaking of his boat and the faint groans of the ice. He looked down at the bottles scattered across the planks, a small collection of glass relics glistening with frost. Among them, the second bottle with its hidden scrap of paper seemed to glow faintly, as though aware of its own importance. Samuel rubbed his hands together for warmth and glanced back at the iceberg. He had the uneasy sense that it was watching him, though he knew it was only ice and frozen glass. Still, the feeling lingered, heavy and insistent. He reached once more, prying at a particularly large bottle wedged near the base of the berg. The ice around it cracked and splintered, water seeping into the gaps. His boat rocked dangerously as he pulled, his weight shifting forward. For a moment, he thought he might tip into the sea, the cold swallowing him whole. But with one final wrench, the bottle broke free, tumbling into the boat with a loud clatter. Samuel fell back, his breath ragged, his hands trembling from the effort. This bottle, too, seemed ordinary, yet he could not shake the growing conviction that none of this was ordinary at all. He stared at the iceberg again, its jagged surface glittering in the pale light, and felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this discovery was unnatural, unsettling, as though the sea had chosen him specifically for this task. Samuel leaned back against the side of the boat, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. His eyes lingered on the bottles he had gathered, and especially on the one with the paper sealed inside. He knew he would have to open it to see what secrets it held, but for now, he let the silence settle around him once more, the cold air filling his lungs, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his mind. The iceberg drifted slowly beside him, creaking faintly as if in response to his hesitation. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, feeling the pull of the ocean beneath him, steady and relentless. He knew there was no turning back now. He had stepped into a story far larger than himself, one written long ago and preserved by the sea. And though he did not yet know what it would reveal, he understood with certainty that his life had changed the moment he laid eyes on that frozen mountain of glass. The boat rocked gently, carrying him and his strange cargo of bottles farther from the shore and deeper into mystery. Samuel opened his eyes again and fixed them on the one bottle that mattered most, the one that held the faded scrap of paper within. The sea was silent, the gulls gone, the world reduced to him, the iceberg and the fragile messages entombed in ice. The unusual discovery was only the beginning, and in his heart Samuel knew that the voices of the past were waiting to be heard. The bottle lay at Samuel's feet, its glass sides glistening with the thin sheen of melted frost, the cork darkened and swollen from years of being pressed tightly against the neck. He had pulled many bottles from the ice, some empty, others broken, their secrets long ago washed away, but this one was different. It carried a presence, a silent weight, as though the sea itself had chosen to protect it until the moment someone worthy came along to receive its story. Samuel sat still for a long while, the cold air filling his lungs and stinging his throat, his fingers hesitating above the fragile glass. The iceberg floated beside him, shifting softly with the currents, the sound of cracking ice faint and persistent, like the breathing of some massive creature. At last, he reached for the knife he always kept at his side, its blade worn but sharp. He pressed the tip carefully against the cork, twisting gently. The cork resisted him at first, refusing to give up its grip after so many decades, but Samuel persisted, pressing harder, his hand trembling not from weakness, but from the sense of what he was about to unleash. A sharp pop rang out as the cork broke free, a sound that seemed strangely loud in the empty air. He set it aside, then tilted the bottle slowly, his other hand open and waiting. From within slid a small yellowed roll of paper. It landed gently in his palm, damp at the edges, fragile as if it might disintegrate if he handled it too roughly. For a moment, he could not bring himself to move. He simply stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs, the world around him holding its breath as he prepared to open it. Carefully, with fingers hardened by years of hauling nets but now softened by reverence, he unrolled the paper. The fibers clung stubbornly to one another, swollen from moisture, but gradually it revealed its words. The writing was shaky, as though penned by a hand weakened by exhaustion and cold. The ink had faded, the lines broken in places, yet the message was clear enough to read. Samuel's eyes moved slowly across the page, and with each word his breath grew shorter. "Please help us. We are caught in the storm. Our ship is broken. The sea has swallowed our strength. We cannot last much longer. If anyone finds this, know that we tried. Know that we fought. But the sea is stronger. Please send help, though it may already be too late." The words ended abruptly, leaving the silence around him heavier than before. Samuel read them again and again, each time feeling the desperation more deeply. He could almost hear the trembling voice of the man who had written it, a final cry flung into the void of the ocean, trusting fate to carry it forward. His hands shook as he lowered the paper, and he realized his breath had grown uneven, his chest rising and falling quickly. He looked at the date scrawled at the top of the page, and the blood drained from his face. Nearly 80 years ago. The paper in his hand was older than him, older than many who still lived in his village. The voice speaking through it belonged to someone who had perished long before Samuel was born. Yet here it was, alive again in his hands. For a long time he could not move. He sat frozen in his boat, the note lying gently in his palm, his eyes fixed on the iceberg. The other bottles gleamed faintly in the pale light, silent witnesses to the despair they carried. Samuel thought of the countless waves that had passed over them, the storms that had raged above, the endless winters and summers that had come and gone. Yet the bottles had endured, sealed in their frozen tomb until today. He turned the paper over, as if hoping for more, but the back was blank, only stained and frayed from its long entrapment. He set it down carefully on a dry cloth, determined to preserve it. The message might be short, but its weight was immense. It was not only a plea for help, but also a fragment of history, a shard of truth about men whose lives had vanished into the silence of the sea. As the thought settled, another memory rose within him, one buried deep in the stories of his childhood. He remembered sitting at the feet of his grandmother as she whispered tales by the fire, stories of men who had sailed out one day and never returned. There had been a storm, she said, a storm so fierce that the sea itself had swallowed an entire boat and its crew. Families had waited at the shore for days, praying for a sign, but none came. The men were declared lost, their fate left to the cruel mercy of the ocean. Children grew up without fathers, wives lived their lives without closure, and the story was passed down as a shadow over the village's history. And now, Samuel realized with a tightening in his chest, he held the proof of that story in his hands. This letter was not just a message. It was a voice from that very storm, a desperate cry preserved in glass and ice, returning at last to those who had been waiting all these years. The gulls swooped lower again, their cries sharp, breaking the stillness. Samuel lifted his head and glanced at the iceberg. His eyes caught on something darker among the scattering of bottles, a shape that did not gleam like glass. He narrowed his eyes, leaning forward, and saw it wedged tightly between two ridges of ice. It was larger than a bottle, rectangular, the edges worn and uneven. His heart skipped. He rowed closer, pressing the hook into the ice once more, chipping and prying as the water splashed cold against his boots. The effort was harder this time, the object buried deeper, but Samuel's determination had grown. He could not leave now, not after what he had already discovered. At last, the ice cracked wide enough, and with a grunt he hauled the object free. It fell into the boat with a heavy thud. Samuel stared down at it, breathless. It was a book. A diary, bound in a cover of worn leather, its surface warped from age, but intact nonetheless. He reached for it, slowly, reverently, brushing away fragments of ice. When his fingers opened the cover, the first page greeted him with words written in a firm hand, words that made his skin prickle with a shiver that reached his bones. "If anyone finds this, remember us." The message stared back at him like a plea, simple and direct and yet heavier than anything he had ever read. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, the diary resting in his lap. He felt the weight of generations pressing upon him, the knowledge that the sea had chosen him to carry this truth back to the world. The letter had been only the beginning. Now, with the diary in his hands, the story was no longer just a whisper of desperation. It was a testament, a deliberate attempt to ensure that their voices would not vanish. Samuel sat there as the waves lapped gently against the boat, the diary resting like a sacred relic in his hands, the iceberg drifting silently at his side. The plea of the letter echoed in his mind, mingling with the memory of his grandmother's stories and the faces of his own people. He knew he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. He was no longer merely a fisherman searching for his daily catch. He had become the keeper of voices, the bearer of a message that had waited nearly a century to be heard. The sea, vast and endless, had guarded these secrets with jealous care. But now it had given them back, and Samuel could not help but wonder why. The diary lay in Samuel's lap, its leather cover stiff with cold, the edges of the pages warped but miraculously whole. His fingers lingered on it, tracing the ridges where the salt and time had scarred the surface. The words he had just read on the first page, "If anyone finds this, remember us," still echoed in his mind, heavier than the gull's cries and the groaning of the iceberg beside him. It was as if those words had waited in silence through endless years of storms and tides, through winters and summers that had erased the memory of the men who wrote them, only to resurface now in the hands of a solitary fisherman. The note from the bottle had been a desperate cry, short and trembling, but the diary felt different. It was deliberate, prepared, meant to last. Samuel turned the first page slowly, almost fearful that the paper would crumble under his touch. To his astonishment, though worn and faintly brittle, the pages held. Ink, faded but still legible, stretched across them in steady lines. The handwriting was firm, the words more carefully shaped than those in the message he had found earlier. He realized with a kind of awe that someone, even in the face of cold and hunger and the certainty of death, had sat down and taken the time to write this. It was not just a record of survival. It was an act of defiance against the silence of the sea. His eyes scanned the first entries, though he could not read them all at once. The language was old-fashioned, the words heavy with the formality of another time. The writer described leaving the harbor, a crew of men strong and hopeful, their nets ready, their families watching from the shore. The early pages carried a tone of pride and resilience, as if they had expected nothing more than another journey, another return with the ocean's bounty. But as he turned further, the tone darkened. The ink grew uneven, the handwriting more hurried. Storms were mentioned, waves described as towering mountains of water, the sky black with rage. Samuel swallowed hard, feeling the rhythm of his own heart quicken. He did not need to read every word to understand what had happened. The sea had turned on them, as it always did when it wished to remind men of their smallness. Yet, what struck him most was not the account of the storm, but the careful way the writer included details of the men themselves. Names appeared in the margins, brief sketches of personalities. One man who sang to keep courage alive, another who prayed aloud, clutching a locket of his children, a third who carved initials into the wood of the deck as though to leave behind proof of his existence. These were not just sailors lost in a storm. They were fathers, sons, and brothers, each clinging to fragments of hope even as the sea dragged them down. Samuel turned another page and gasped softly. Folded between the leaves was a photograph. He lifted it carefully, his thumb brushing across the thin surface. It was black and white, faded but clear enough to reveal the faces of men standing before a small wooden house. Their clothes were simple, their expressions proud and solemn, but what struck Samuel most was how familiar they looked. Not the men themselves, perhaps, but the eyes, the lines of their faces, the kind of expressions he had seen in his own village countless times. He turned the photograph over and saw numbers written on the back in dark ink. They made little sense to him now, but he tucked the photo carefully back into the diary, knowing it was part of something larger. He kept reading. More photographs followed, tucked between entries. Families this time. Women holding children, boys with fishing nets, girls standing barefoot near the shore. Each one had numbers written on the reverse. Samuel frowned, unable to decipher their meaning, but he felt the intent behind them. These were not random. They were left as clues, a code written into the very fabric of memory. Near the end of the diary, the writing grew more frantic. The entries shortened, sentences broken off midway. The ink was blotched, smudged by shaken hands or falling drops of seawater. Yet, even then, the writer persisted, determined to leave behind something more than silence. On one of the final pages, Samuel found an entire sheet filled with nothing but numbers. long lines of them written with painstaking care, as though the writer had poured the last of his strength into ensuring they were recorded. Samuel traced the lines with his finger, confusion knotting in his chest. They seemed endless, but he knew instinctively that they meant something. Coordinates, perhaps, though he had not yet matched them against his own knowledge of maps. He felt a shiver of recognition, as though the answer was just beyond his reach. The diary slipped slightly in his hands as the boat rocked beneath him. He glanced up and saw the iceberg still drifting, its jagged sides glinting with trapped bottles. The sight unnerved him more than before. It was not only a mass of ice and glass, it was a tomb, a grave that had carried this diary across decades of silence. And now it had chosen to reveal itself, not to anyone, but to him. The thought unsettled him deeply. Why him, of all people? He was no scholar, no historian, no man of influence. He was just a fisherman, his days filled with nets and salt and solitude. Yet here he sat, holding the final testimony of men who had been lost to the sea generations ago. The words on the first page returned to him, whispering in the back of his mind, "If anyone finds this, remember us." Samuel closed the diary gently, holding it against his chest for a moment, as if to feel the lives still pulsing within its pages. He thought of his grandmother's stories again, of the nights when she spoke of men who had gone out and never returned. He remembered how her eyes would glisten in the firelight, her voice lowering as though the very walls might betray her grief. And now he understood that those stories were not just whispers meant to frighten children. They were fragments of a truth that had never been found. Until now. He opened his eyes and looked at the diary again, the leather cover cracked but steadfast. It had endured so much. Salt, cold, pressure, time itself, and yet it remained. That endurance felt symbolic, a reminder that memory could survive even when flesh and bone were lost. Samuel felt a stirring inside him, a responsibility that made his chest heavy. These men had entrusted their story to the sea, and now the sea had entrusted it to him. He could not let it be forgotten again. The sun had climbed higher, though its warmth did not reach him. The mist was lifting slowly, revealing more of the endless horizon. Samuel tucked the diary safely into a dry corner of the boat, wrapped in cloth to keep it from further harm. His eyes lingered on it, then drifted back to the iceberg, which groaned faintly as cracks split its surface. For a moment, he imagined it breaking apart entirely, bottles tumbling into the water, pages scattering to the depths. The thought made his stomach tighten. He had rescued only a fraction of what it carried, but even that fraction was enough to change everything. He sat back, rubbing his hands together, his mind full of images from the diary. Men clutching ropes and singing to fight the storm. Children smiling in photographs, their lives cut short by loss. Numbers scrawled in ink, pointing to some truth yet undiscovered. He knew he had to return home, to lay this story before his people, to see if the faces in the photographs would be recognized. Perhaps the numbers would lead them to the final resting place of the lost boat. Perhaps they would finally bring peace to families who had waited lifetimes for answers. As he rowed slowly away from the iceberg, the diary secure at his side, Samuel felt the ocean shift beneath him once more. The water seemed calmer now, as though the sea itself had acknowledged the passing of its burden. The gulls had fallen silent, circling high above without descending. He glanced back one last time at the iceberg, its jagged edges shrinking in the distance, and felt both relief and sorrow. It had given him its secrets, but he sensed it still held more, forever beyond his reach. Samuel tightened his grip on the oars, his arms burning as he pulled against the water. Ahead, somewhere beyond the mist, his village waited. He imagined the faces of his neighbors, the elders who still spoke of the old storm, the children who knew only fragments of its tale. Soon, he would place the diary in their hands, and the voices of the lost would speak again. The thought both comforted and frightened him. He had always been a man of the present, his days bound to the tides and the catch. Now the past had claimed him, and he could not turn away. The boat rocked gently as he rowed, the sea sighing against its sides. Samuel's gaze fell once more to the diary, and he whispered softly, though no one could hear him, "I remember you." And with that, he pressed forward into the horizon, the weight of the dead resting on his shoulders, the promise of truth leading him home. The diary sat open across Samuel's knees, its weight strangely heavy, as though it carried not paper and ink alone, but the gravity of entire lives. He had rowed until his arms burned, until the iceberg was no more than a jagged shadow on the horizon, but his eyes kept drifting back to the pages, unable to let them rest. The sea around him was calm now, almost unnaturally so, as though the waters themselves had stilled in deference to the words preserved within the old leather binding. He turned the pages slowly, careful not to tear them, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air as he read. At first, the entries were ordinary, descriptions of daily life at sea, nets lowered and raised, arguments over weather, laughter between crewmates in the cramped quarters of the boat. He could almost hear the men's voices, rough and tired, yet alive with the small joys of survival. But as he pressed further into the diary, the tone shifted. The writing grew terse, sentences shorter. The ink pressed harder into the paper as though carved by urgency. It spoke of storms that would not relent, supplies dwindling, cold gnawing into their bones. And between these grim passages, Samuel began to find the photographs. They had been tucked carefully between the pages, preserved by some miracle of ice and time. The first showed 3 men standing together on the deck of a boat, their faces solemn, their eyes squinting against the wind. They looked weathered but proud, bound by the brotherhood of the sea. Samuel turned the photo over and found a string of numbers written in dark ink. At first, they meant nothing to him, only a jumble of figures lined neatly across the back. He set it aside and turned the page. Another photograph slipped free. This one was of a family, a woman in a long dress, her arms wrapped around 2 children. They stood before a small wooden house with a fishing net hanging to dry behind them. Their smiles were faint but real, captured in that frozen moment of time. Again, on the back of the photo, numbers were scrawled. Samuel's brow furrowed as he read them. They were different from the first set, yet written with the same deliberate care. It was no accident, no meaningless scribble. Whoever had hidden these photographs had meant for the numbers to survive along with the faces. He continued, each new page yielding more images. A young boy holding a wooden toy boat. A group of fishermen mending nets on the shore. Women gathered by the harbor with baskets of fish. Each picture carried with it a sense of intimacy, fragments of a world long gone. And each one bore numbers on the reverse. Samuel laid them out beside him, his boat rocking gently as the collection grew. He found himself staring not only at the faces, but at their eyes. Something about them was achingly familiar. He could not name them, yet he felt he had seen these expressions before. In the laughter of his neighbors, in the lined faces of the elders, in the children who played along the shore of his own village. When he reached the final pages of the diary, he discovered what seemed at first like chaos. One entire sheet was covered in numbers, written line after line until the ink grew blotched and uneven. There were no words, no explanation, only the relentless repetition of figures. Samuel stared at them, his breath shallow. He traced them with his finger as though the meaning might rise from the page and reveal itself. They were too precise to be random, too carefully recorded to be meaningless. A chill went through him as realization struck. They were coordinates, latitude and longitude, marked with the desperate hope that someone, someday, would follow them. He closed his eyes, the diary pressed tightly against his chest. Coordinates. A map, hidden within the last words of dying men. They had left behind a trail, a path to the place where their journey had ended. The photographs were not merely memories, they were witnesses, faces to be remembered, proof of lives that had been swallowed by the sea. Samuel felt a deep shudder move through him. He had known, from the moment he opened the bottle, that his life would change, but now the enormity of it pressed upon him fully. The boat rocked gently, and Samuel looked again at the photographs spread across the planks. The numbers stared back at him, silent and insistent. He imagined the writer of the diary, huddled in the darkness of a failing ship, scratching down those figures with frozen hands, fighting against the storm that threatened to erase them. The determination in that act struck him like a blow. These were not men who had surrendered quietly. Even as death closed in, they had carved a path forward, a way for their story to outlive them. Samuel thought again of his grandmother's stories, of the storm she had spoken of with such quiet reverence. In those nights by the fire, she had whispered of men who never returned, of families left with unanswered prayers. He remembered the sorrow in her voice, the way her hands had clutched at her shawl as though to hold on to something solid against the memory of loss. And now, nearly a century later, the truth of those whispers sat in his hands. The faces in the photographs, the voices in the diary, the numbers etched into the margins, they all pointed to the same revelation. The lost men were not forgotten. They had left behind their testimony, and Samuel had become its keeper. He gathered the photographs carefully, stacking them in order, and slipped them back between the pages of the diary. His fingers lingered on the worn leather cover as he tied it shut once more with a piece of cloth. The sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, painting the horizon in muted shades of orange and gray. The air had grown colder, the mist rising again from the water. Samuel felt the weight of the diary against his chest as he tucked it into his coat, as though to protect it from the chill. It was more than paper now. It was a bridge between the living and the dead, between the present and the past. The sea groaned faintly, waves lapping against the side of his boat, but Samuel no longer heard them in the same way. He was thinking of the village, of the people who still told the old story, of the children who would grow up not knowing that the truth had finally returned. He imagined the moment he would place the diary before them, the photographs spread across the table, the numbers traced on a map. He pictured the recognition in their eyes, the tears, the relief, and the sorrow. For so long they had lived with uncertainty. Soon they would have answers. Yet, along with this thought came fear. What if the truth brought more pain than peace? What if the families, after all these years, could not bear the weight of what had been uncovered? Samuel tightened his grip on the oars, his jaw set. He could not choose silence. The sea had entrusted him with this burden, and it was not his place to hide it. He would carry it back, no matter what the cost. The sun dipped further, shadows stretching across the water, and Samuel rowed on. Each pull of the oars felt heavier than the last, not because of his tired muscles, but because of the enormity of what he carried. The diary pressed against him like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. The faces in the photographs haunted his vision, familiar strangers who demanded to be seen again. And the numbers, those long lines of figures, burned in his mind with a quiet, relentless urgency. Night began to fall, the sky deepening into blue, stars pricking faintly into existence above the horizon. Samuel's breath came in clouds of white as he rode toward the distant lights of his village. The sea whispered around him, no longer hostile but solemn, as though acknowledging that its secret had finally been released. He felt the pull of destiny in every wave that lifted his boat, every gust of wind that filled the air. He was no longer just a fisherman returning from a day's work. He was the bearer of voices long silenced, the keeper of a story that demanded to be told. And as he pressed forward into the night, Samuel knew that the numbers would not let him rest until he revealed their meaning. They were a map, a key, a final gift from those who had vanished. And soon, very soon, he would place them on the table in his small home and trace them against the chart. The past was no longer lost. It was alive, beating in his hands, waiting for its truth to be spoken. The sea carried Samuel's boat steadily toward the faint outline of the shore, the village lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. His arms ached from hours of rowing, his back bent with fatigue, but he barely noticed the pain. Every stroke of the oars seemed guided not by his muscles, but by the weight of what he carried pressed against his chest. The diary lay tucked securely inside his coat, wrapped in cloth, while the photographs and the fragile note rested in a small wooden box at his feet. The numbers etched into his memory pulsed with a strange, living urgency, as though they were calling him home as much as the tide itself. Night had deepened fully now. The stars glittered above, reflected in the dark waters that spread endlessly in every direction. Samuel's breath came in short clouds of frost, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him on shore. He pictured the elders of his village, men and women whose lives had been defined by the stories of those who vanished. He pictured children, listening wide-eyed, their imaginations filled with the mystery of a tragedy that had become part of their heritage. And he pictured the families, those who still carried the grief of unanswered loss, who had never known what became of their fathers and grandfathers. Soon, all of them would know. As the boat slid closer to land, Samuel thought again of the faces in the photographs. The men standing proudly on the deck, the families by the wooden houses, the children holding simple toys. Their eyes seemed to follow him even now, reflected in the rippling water at his side. He shivered and looked away, though not from fear. It was not fear, but an overwhelming sense of kinship, as if the sea had bound him to them across the decades. He belonged to their story now as much as they belonged to his. When the keel scraped gently against the sand, Samuel exhaled a long breath he had not realized he was holding. He pulled the boat ashore, his muscles groaning with the effort, then gathered the diary and the photographs with the care one might give to a newborn child. The village lay silent under the glow of lanterns, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, the scent of salt and wood fire drifting together in the air. He walked slowly through the narrow path that led to his small house, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Inside, the familiar smell of damp wood and fish nets greeted him. He set the diary down on his table and unwrapped it with deliberate slowness. His hands trembled, though he told himself it was from exhaustion. He lit a small oil lamp, the flame flickering and casting long shadows across the room. Then, with a deep breath, he spread the photographs out across the table one by one. The faces stared back at him, silent but insistent, their eyes shining faintly in the golden light. Samuel reached for the rolled map he kept tucked in a drawer, an old chart of the coastline and the wider ocean beyond. He smoothed it across the table, the paper brittle at the edges, and then opened the diary to the page filled with numbers. He studied them carefully, tracing each line, comparing them against the coordinates on the map. His heart quickened as he realized that the numbers aligned with a particular region of the sea, a place whispered about in his youth, the last known location where a fishing boat had vanished nearly a century ago. It struck him, then, with a force that made him sit back in his chair. These coordinates were not random at all. They marked the grave of the lost men, the final place where they had struggled against the storm. The photographs and numbers together were not merely keepsakes, they were a message meant to endure, a map to ensure that their story would never sink into oblivion. Samuel felt his throat tighten as he looked at the map, the truth settling into his bones. He had uncovered the secret that his village had lived with in silence for generations. The following morning, he carried the diary and the photographs to the home of the eldest villager, a woman named Mariah, whose hair was as white as sea foam and whose eyes still held the clarity of one who had lived long enough to remember more than most. She welcomed him with quiet curiosity, and when he laid the diary before her, her wrinkled hands trembled. She turned the pages slowly, her lips moving silently as she read, tears welling in her eyes. When she reached the photographs, her breath caught sharply. "This is my grandfather," she whispered, her voice breaking, as she pressed one of the photographs to her chest. Her hands shook, and tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. Samuel watched silently as she traced the faces with her fingers, her grief mingling with relief. At last, after all these years, she had proof that the stories were real. News spread quickly through the village. By evening, families had gathered in the square, drawn together by the promise of truth. Samuel stood before them with the diary in his hands, his voice steady but low as he read the words aloud. The entries filled the air with echoes of the past, descriptions of storms, of hope, of despair, of the desperate will to be remembered. The villagers listened in silence, many of them weeping openly. When the photographs were passed around, cries of recognition filled the air. Names long spoken only in mourning were called out again, breathed into life through the faces on the fragile prints. An old man fell to his knees as he clutched a photograph of two fishermen standing arm in arm, his sobs racking his frail body. Another woman whispered the name of her ancestor over and over, holding the image to her heart as if it could bring him back. Children sat wide-eyed, their parents bending low to explain the story of bravery and loss that had shaped their village. The grief of generations broke open that night, but along with it came a strange peace. The silence of the past was finally broken, replaced by the voices of their own blood, carried home through ice and glass. Samuel stood apart, watching the scene unfold. He felt the heaviness of his responsibility, but also the quiet relief of having fulfilled it. He thought of the words written on the first page of the diary, "If anyone finds this, remember us," and realized that he had given those words life. They were no longer whispers lost to the sea. They had become part of the village again, etched into its memory as firmly as any stone or timber. Later that evening, when the lanterns burned low and the people slowly dispersed, Samuel walked to the shore. The diary still rested in his hands, though now it felt less like a burden and more like a companion. He stood at the water's edge, the waves brushing softly against the rocks, and gazed out at the horizon. Somewhere beyond, in the depths marked by those coordinates, the bones of a boat and the last echoes of its crew still lay in the embrace of the sea. But here, in his hands and in the hearts of his people, their story had risen again. The tide hissed against the stones, carrying the salt smell of eternity, and Samuel closed his eyes. He had brought the truth home. The men had not vanished without a trace. Their voices had endured, frozen in time, waiting for someone to listen. And he had listened. He had remembered. The village awoke to a silence that felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of the revelations from the night before lingered in the air. The sun was pale as it climbed above the horizon, its light weak against the winter sky, but it spread across the rooftops and the frost-covered ground like a blessing. Samuel walked slowly through the narrow streets, the diary pressed against his chest as it had been since the moment he had pried it free from the ice. Every house he passed seemed to watch him, every door and shutter carrying the echo of voices that had cried out in grief and recognition the night before. The air was full of memory, the kind that did not fade with dawn. That evening, the villagers gathered once again, this time not out of curiosity but out of something deeper, a need to listen, to hold the truth in their hands, to honor the voices that had come back from the silence of the sea. The square filled gradually. Lanterns lit one by one as the shadows lengthened, their light reflecting off the frost and turning the night into a trembling glow of gold and fire. Samuel stood at the center, a diary resting on the table before him, the photographs spread out in neat lines so that everyone could see them. Faces from the past stared back at the living, solemn and steady, waiting to be remembered. The villagers sat quietly, their breaths rising in faint clouds, their eyes fixed on the relics of their history. An old woman, her hair wrapped in a scarf, held one of the photographs close, whispering the name of the man pictured there, a name she had not spoken aloud in decades. Beside her, a young boy leaned against her arm, wide-eyed as he listened, his mind painting pictures of a great-grandfather he had never known. Another family stood near the front, their father gripping the diary so tightly his knuckles whitened, his tears falling freely as he traced the inked words of men who had sailed into the storm so long ago. Samuel began to read once more, his voice steady though his throat was dry. The words of the diary filled the night, rising above the crackle of lantern flames and the whisper of the sea in the distance. He read of storms that tore at the sails, of hunger that gnawed at the men, of prayers whispered into the wind. He read of courage, of men who sang against despair, of fathers who clutched photographs of their children to their hearts as the waves rose higher. And when he reached the final page, the sheet filled with numbers, he did not falter. He held it high, letting the villagers see it, and spoke of the coordinates that marked the grave of their ancestors. The people listened in silence, some clutching one another, some pressing hands to their mouths to stifle sobs. It was not only grief that filled the square, but also a strange kind of peace. For the first time in generations, they knew the truth. The men had not vanished into nothingness, had not abandoned their families. They had fought, they had written, they had sung and prayed and wept, and they had left behind a map of their suffering so that their voices could return home. As Samuel closed the diary, the square erupted in quiet murmurs. Families embraced, names were spoken aloud with reverence, and children asked questions that their parents now had the answers to. An old man fell to his knees, the photograph of his grandfather pressed against his heart, his tears dripping onto the frost. A woman clutched a photograph of a mother and 2 children, whispering that one of the faces was her own grandmother, lost to time but alive again in that fragile print. The villagers wept openly, but their grief was no longer hollow. It was full, complete, touched with the relief that comes when uncertainty finally gives way to truth. Samuel stepped back, watching it unfold. He felt both apart from them and deeply bound to them, a man chosen by the sea to carry its burden home. He thought of the iceberg, still drifting somewhere in the vast waters, its jagged sides gleaming with trapped bottles that no one else would ever see. He wondered how many more voices still slept within its frozen heart, but he no longer felt the need to return. What he had brought back was enough. The dead had been heard, and their story would not be lost again. Later, when the square had emptied and the lanterns flickered low, Samuel walked to the edge of the shore. The diary was once more in his hands, its weight both heavy and comforting. The waves brushed gently against the rocks, whispering as they always had, but tonight the sound was different. It was softer, less merciless, almost like a lullaby. He stood there a long time, the cold biting into his skin, his breath misting in the night air, and let the rhythm of the sea wash over him. He thought of the men who had written those words, men who had clung to hope even as the storm raged around them. He thought of the children in the photographs, their lives lived in the brief space before grief descended on their families. He thought of the voices that had called across time, sealed in glass, waiting to be found. And he thought of himself, a fisherman who had gone out to sea expecting nothing more than the day's catch, only to return carrying the voices of an entire generation. As the moon climbed higher, silvering the waves, Samuel pressed the diary against his chest and whispered into the night. He whispered thanks to the men who had trusted the sea with their story, thanks to the sea itself for finally releasing it, thanks to the voices that had given his people peace. His words were carried away by the wind, but he knew they were heard. Somewhere, in the depths where the lost boat rested, the echoes of his voice would reach them. Behind him, the village lay quiet, but Samuel knew it would never be the same. The children who had listened that night would grow up with the story not as a whisper, but as a truth carved into the heart of their community. The elders would sleep more peacefully, their unanswered questions finally laid to rest. And the faces in the photographs would live on, not only in paper and ink, but in memory, passed down from voice to voice, from heart to heart. Samuel turned from the sea at last, his steps slow but steady. The diary was no longer only an artifact. It was part of him now, part of the village, part of the bond between the living and the dead. The sea had carried its voices back, and he had listened. That was enough. As he walked toward the warm glow of his home, the waves murmured behind him, their endless song no longer threatening, no longer cruel. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt that the sea and he were no longer adversaries. They were bound together in remembrance, in the eternal truth that no voice, once spoken, is ever truly lost. And so the voices returned from the sea, carried on ice and glass, found their way home at last. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss the next one. We have even more unbelievable true stories waiting for you. Watch the next video on your screen and dive deeper into mysteries you won't believe actually happened. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can join you in uncovering